Hello and welcome to the shed. In today's video we're going to be diagnosing what's wrong with this chair in order to start a repair. Hope you enjoy. In order to diagnose what's wrong with this chair, we first need to look at the anatomy of it and how it's actually put together. So there's a few key things here that tell me how it's put together. So for the sake of this video, I'm just going to start at the top and we'll work our way down, determining how the chair's put together and the joints. So if we look right up here, we can see that it's very flush. The attachment's right up in here. The joints are very flush here, which indicates that there's some sort of a shoulder on this joint up here. So if we look just here, we can see there's a little tiny dowel. And that gives me a pretty good indication of the joint used to hold this piece into these uprights. So the presence of these dowels and how tight that shoulder is there leads me to believe that it is actually held together with pinned tenons. The dowel allows a nice tight joint, pulls the tenon right in, and even when the glue fails, the mechanical force of that dowel, unless the tenon breaks, actually holds the joint together. These joints up here, pin tenons. Now if we look at these uprights in here, both sides, we can see there's no active dowels, there's no dowels in any spots holding a pin tenon here. But if we look closer at this bottom piece that's holding them in, and look down here, once again we have the presence of that dowel just here. Now that means that this piece here is most likely a pinned tenon as well, which means these uprights here are probably just glued in to some tenons. They don't require pinning because the top cross piece and the bottom cross piece here are both pinned in place, and as they can't move, the glue gives out on these pieces here. There's no way for them to actually come out of the tenon, so I suspect that these were just glued into place. So now we're moving down to the main part of the seat, the main structure that holds it together. And on every single one of these joints, I see we had double dowels here. And on the back, once again, we have a single dowel. So we can see just here, these two corners here, on both sides, we have a double pin here, which indicates that it was a pin tenon once again, but in this case, it was double pinned to add a little bit of extra strength. Because on these corners where we have two rails coming in, we've got a much smaller tenon, so I believe, and we also have a wider tenon here, that double pinning was used to make sure that the strength was in the top and the bottom of that tenon, to make sure there was no movement in these shoulders here. So moving on down to the bottom rails here that support the bottom of the legs of this chair, once again we have a pin tenon here, and they run round on these three bits down the bottom here that support it. Then the last piece we want to look at is this cross stretcher here and how that is put together. We want to be looking here and here, and we can clearly see there's a dovetail shape here. Now we have the same corresponding dovetail shape on the top here. Now that lets me believe and lets me know that this is a sliding dovetail. Now, I haven't talked much about sliding dovetails. I haven't done any videos on that, so that is something that I'll cover on the future, and I'll show you how to actually make a sliding dovetail. But sliding dovetails are excellent for situations like on my tool cabinet behind me, where you're putting a shelf into two sides, because with the dovetail shape, if you make it nice and tight, there's no way that this piece here can actually push out sideways, which means that the chair stays together in sort of this movement through the bottom here, because these two rails have no chance of actually moving in opposite directions, so it keeps it nice and tight together. So now we know how the main carcass of this chair is actually held together. That gives us an idea of what we're looking for when there's movement, and gives us some key indicators as to what's likely to be the cause of the problem in a chair constructed with pinned mortise and tenons like this. Now, some of you might have said that I didn't mention these pieces here. Well, these just happen to be little triangles that are actually screwed into place that holds the base of the chair, which is obviously missing from this particular chair. Now, the problem with this chair is that the whole thing is actually rocking. Now, you've got to put quite a bit of weight on it. So I'll just show you a little video. So if you look closely, just here, it's hard to get on camera, but we have movement in this shoulder, we have movement in this shoulder. The same thing is happening. You could see that there was movement there within those tendon joints. We also have a little bit of movement up here. You can hear that little click sound. The outer two rails up here are held in place, but this middle one is actually moving a little bit, which means that either the wood is shrunk or the mortise and tenons were made a little bit larger than they probably should have, and the glue is no longer holding it together. But the fact that the glue is no longer holding it together leads me to believe that it was constructed with some sort of hide glue, which is dried up and is no longer performing its function. Because from what I know of PVA glue, if that was what was used, that doesn't tend to dry up and let go of the timber. Now, I don't know how old these chairs are. I did remove one of the flathead screws that holds these little bracing pieces for the base of the chair in here. And if we look at this screw, it's a standard construction flathead screw. It's not an old screw. It goes right to a point and it's not flat, which means that it's not a particularly old screw. It is, however, made out of steel and is rusted. So my guess is that if this was an older chair at some point, the screws were replaced at some point, or it's a more modern maker that has made this and just liked the use of the traditional joinery and just wanted to make something most likely by hand. As I said before, these pinned mortise and tenon joints are a physical joint, and if that glue does give way, the joint should still hold perfectly well. And in actual fact, traditionally, a lot of mortise and tenon joints that were pinned were done without any glue whatsoever. So, if that's a physical joint that can be held together without the glue, and we no longer have the glue holding the joint together, why do we have movement? Well, it's really one of two options that I can see that's caused that. Either the pins in the tenons have broken, or the tenons themselves have broken. Now, when I've looked at some other chairs like this that have been broken, it tends to be the tenon that breaks. Probably with somebody swinging on the chair or whatever. The cross grain of the pin doesn't tend to break, but the shorter grain in the long grain of the tenon can break, push out of the way, and that allows some movement because the pin is no longer holding the tenon into place. Now, as with these joints here, those tenons, because there's two of them, are quite small tenons, which means there's not much material between where the pin goes in and the end of the tenon, which means you're actually putting the force through the weaker part of the tenon. So that is what I suspect has happened. So there you have it, folks. That's the process I run through to see how the chair is actually put together, and then some of the possible causes based off that as to what could be the problem when you are diagnosing and maybe choosing a piece of furniture, or in this case a chair, that you'd want to restore. So I just want to give a big thank you to my patrons on Patreon. I very much appreciate your support, and if any of you out there would like to continue to support me, please consider pledging on Patreon. And if you'd like to see some other videos where I restore a nice transitional plane, please check out the video down here. Bye for now.